The county tax assessor knocks on a permanent foundation. He never knocks on a trailer hitch. That one sentence is the reason a growing number of men across the country are quietly walking away from forever mortgages and building something that looks like this instead. Picture a steel hull, curved like an old military shelter, sitting in 3 feet of fresh snow. Inside, a wood stove is roaring. Outside, the temperature is below freezing and falling. And on paper, in the eyes of the government, this entire structure barely exists. No real estate tax bill. No annual assessment. No knock on the door every spring asking for thousands of dollars just for owning a place to sleep. This sounds too good to be true. So before anything else, here's the catch nobody puts in the title. Because if you skip it, you could build something illegal in your own backyard without knowing it. Most property tax in this country is not really a tax on shelter. It is a tax on permanence. Counties and states tax real property, anything that is fixed to the land, anything with foundation, anything that cannot legally drive away. The law was written assuming a house stays where you put it forever. It was never written with a steel cabin on 2 axles in mind. So when a builder puts that same cabin on a trailer frame, gives a VIN number, and registers it the same way you would register a car, something strange happens on paper. The structure is no longer classified as a house. It is classified as a vehicle. And in most jurisdictions, vehicles are not subject to the same property tax that crushes homeowners every single year. This is not a rumor. This is not a workaround some guy found on a forum. This is the same legal principle that has let RV owners avoid property tax for decades. The difference is that nobody used to build something this solid, this insulated, and this livable on top of that principle. Most RVs are flimsy. This is not. It helps to understand why this gap in the law has existed so long without closing. Lawmakers writing property tax codes decades ago were picturing house trailers parked behind a relative's barn, not insulated steel cabins with stoves and solar power. The law never caught up to how good these builds have become. And until it does, the gap stays open for anyone willing to build correctly and follow the rules around it. Now here comes a part most videos skip, and it is a part that actually matters if you plan to do this yourself. Wheels do not make you invisible to every tax. They make you invisible to one specific tax. You will likely still pay a registration fee or an excise tax on the trailer itself, the same way you pay every year to register a truck. In a small number of states, RVs and trailers above a certain value get taxed almost like real property anyway, which quietly closes a loophole, depending on where you live. You also will not get a normal residential address in most cases, which means no standard utility hookup, no mailbox tied to that exact structure, and complications if you ever try to get a loan using it as collateral. Some counties have started cracking down hard on what they call real estate, specifically targeting structures that look suspiciously like permanent homes wearing wheels as a costume. If a structure never moves for years, sits on blocks, gets skirted like a mobile home, and gets hooked up to permanent septic and power lines, an assessor can argue in court that it functions as real property regardless of what the title says. That argument has won before. So the real loophole is not wheels equals zero tax. The real loophole is personal property classification under specific legal conditions equals far lower tax than real property classification. That is a very different sentence, and it is the one that actually keeps you safe. Run the numbers on a normal house for a second, because this is where the math actually starts to feel personal. A modest home valued in the middle range of most rural counties can carry an annual property tax bill running anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000, sometimes more, depending on the state and the local school district funding formula behind it. That bill does not disappear when the mortgage gets paid off. It does not disappear when the man living there retires. It does not even disappear if the house burns down until the rebuild is finished and reassessed. It is a permanent monthly cost disguised as an annual one, and it compounds every single year the homeowner is alive. A trailer classified structure swaps that bill for a one-time or annual registration fee that, in most states, lands somewhere between $50 and a few $100. Multiply the difference across 20 or 30 years of ownership, and the gap stops looking like a clever trick and starts looking like an entire second retirement account that simply never got drained. With that out of the way, here's what was actually built. because the legal trick only matters if the structure itself can survive a real winter. The shape is the first decision, and it is not just for looks. That curved steel roof is a Quonset-style arch, a design pulled straight from military engineering nearly a century ago. The reason it still gets used today is brutally simple. Snow does not sit on a curve. It slides. A flat roof has to be engineered to hold thousands of pounds of accumulated snow load, which means more material, more cost, more risk of collapse if it is not maintained. A curved arch shrugs that weight off by design. Less structural stress. Less money spent fighting physics. More money spent on things that actually matter inside. That arch is built from corrugated galvanized steel, the same family of material you'd see on an old grain silo or a Quonset hut on a military base. It is cheap relative to traditional framing. It goes up fast, and it is nearly immune to the kind of weather damage that destroys with siding over a decade of exposure. But steel alone is a problem in cold climates, because steel transfers heat and cold instantly. Stand inside an uninsulated steel shell in January, and you will understand why men freeze in things that look impressive on camera. Builds like this one typically land somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000, depending on size, insulation quality, and how much labor is done by the owner instead of paid out to a contractor. A man with welding experience and a few willing friends can knock months off the timeline and thousands off the final bill. A man paying a crew for every step, from bending the steel arch to running the wood interior, should expect to pay closer to the top of that range, and should expect the build itself to take anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months depending on weather, permitting, and how complicated the interior finish gets. Either way, that number still sits far below the cost of a stick-built cabin of similar size on a poured foundation, before a single year property tax even enters the conversation. That is where the next decision comes in, and it is the one most viewers do not expect. Underneath that steel skin is a heavy layer of insulation, and on the inside, raw wood paneling takes over completely. You can see it the second you look at the door. That is not a steel door bolted onto a steel frame. That is a thick, reclaimed style wood door, set into a wood-framed entrance, sitting inside a steel shell like a hidden cabin tucked inside a bunker. The wood is not decoration. Wood insulates far better than bare metal, and it gives the inside of the structure something steel can never give on its own. Warmth that actually feels like warmth, not just a number on a thermostat. This is the first thing that should raise a question in your mind if you are actually considering building one of these. A steel shell with no insulation is a freezer with windows. A steel shell with proper insulation and a wood interior is a genuine survivable winter shelter. The difference between those two outcomes is a few $1,000s and an entire winter of either comfort or misery. Now look higher toward the front of the roofline, and you will see the detail that tells you this builder was thinking past the photograph. A stovepipe rises straight out of the curved steel roof, with visible heat-resistant flashing around the base where it punches through. That is not cosmetic. That is a wood-burning stove, vented correctly through a metal structure that could otherwise become dangerous if that vent were installed wrong. This single detail is where a lot of amateur builds fail. Cutting a hole through a curved steel roof and venting a hot stovepipe through it without the correct clearance, the correct flashing, and the correct fire-rated collar is one of the most common ways these off-grid builds catch fire or fail in inspection completely. Heat plus steel plus improper clearance is not a small mistake. It is the difference between a cozy night in a snowstorm and an emergency call to a fire department that may be 40 minutes away on unplowed roads. So if you take nothing else from the technical side of this, take this. The wood stove is the heart of why this structure can survive deep cold, but it is also the single most dangerous component if it is installed incorrectly. Anyone attempting this build needs to treat that stovepipe penetration as the most important inch of the entire structure, not an afterthought bolted on at the end. Move down to the windows next, and you will notice they are small and set deep into the wood-framed wall, glowing warm and orange against the blue of the snow outside. Small windows are not a budget compromise here. They are a climate decision. Every square foot of glass is a square foot of heat loss in winter. Builders who actually understand cold climates keep window space deliberately small and use double pane or even triple pane glass to slow the heat loss down. The warm light glowing through that snowstorm is not just a nice shot for a thumbnail. It is proof that the heating system inside is actually working against brutal conditions outside in real time without flinching. Now drop down the part most viewers scroll past without thinking about at all. The trailer frame itself, sitting on 2 axles with 4 tires built to carry serious weight. This is not a single-axle utility trailer rated for a few hundred pounds of cargo. A structure this heavy, with steel cladding, with framing, insulation, a stove, and furniture inside, needs a trailer rated for several thousand pounds, with axles and tires matched to that weight, or the entire build becomes a rolling hazard the first time it has to go down a real highway. This is the unglamorous engineering that separates a real off-grid cabin from a structure that looks finished in photos and falls apart, or worse, fails catastrophically, the first time it actually has to move. Anyone chasing this trend purely for the tax angle and skipping the trailer engineering is building a structure that might be illegal to tow at all, regardless of what taxes it avoids. None of this matters if the inside of the cabin cannot actually function without a city utility line running to it, because the entire point of staying off the real property tax rolls is staying disconnected from the systems that would tie the structure to one parcel of land. Power usually comes from a solar setup on the roof feeding a battery bank inside, size of run lights, a water pump, and small electronics through the darkest stretch of winter, sometimes backed up by a small generator for the days the sun simply does not show up. Water typically comes from a fresh tank filled manually or hauled in, paired with a basic gray water or holding tank setup instead of a permanent septic line. The same systems used in serious overland RVs rather than a flimsy add-on. None of this is glamorous, and none of it shows up in a thumbnail. But skip it, and the cabin becomes a steel shell that looks finished and functions like a tent. So who does this actually make sense for, realistically, once the romance of the photo wears off? This makes sense for a man who wants a genuine off-grid retreat and does not need it tied to one specific plot of land forever. It makes sense for someone planning to use it seasonally, hauling it out to remote land for a hunting season or deep winter, then pulling it back closer to civilization the rest of the year. It makes sense as a rentable asset, something that can sit on a piece of land as a short-term rental cabin without triggering the same tax burden a permanent guest house would. And it makes sense for someone who genuinely values mobility over permanence, someone who would rather hitch up and leave than be tied to one parcel of dirt for the next 30 years. Think about the man who already owns 5 or 10 acres of raw land somewhere remote, land he bought cheap precisely because nobody else wanted to build on it. A traditional house on that land means a permanent foundation, a building permit process that can take a year, a septic system, a well, and a tax bill that starts the moment the assessor drives by and sees a roof line. This same man, with the same land, can drop a structure like this one on a gravel pad, run it off solar and a propane tank, and be sleeping inside it within months instead of years, with a tax bill closer to what he pays to register his truck. If his plans change, if the job moves him across the state, if he simply decides he wants to be somewhere else next winter, he hitches up and leaves. The land stays his. The structure goes with him. A man with a permanent foundation does not have that option. He is stuck negotiating a sale, paying a realtor, and waiting months for a buyer, while this man is already 3 states away, parked somewhere warmer, paying the same low registration fee paid the year before. It does not make sense for a man chasing a forever home with a real foundation, real plumbing tied permanently into a municipal system, and a real street address. It does not make sense for anyone living somewhere with strict HOA rules or local ordinances that already specifically ban long-term trailer dwelling, because those rules exist in more places than people expect. And it does not make sense for anyone who plans to park it permanently, skirt like a mobile home, and never move it again, because that is exactly the pattern that gets these structures reclassified as real property the moment an assessor decides to look closely. Before anyone gets inspired enough to start welding steel arches this weekend, here's the single sentence that matters more than anything else in this entire video. Tax law on trailers, RVs, and mobile structures varies wildly from county to county and state to state, and a loophole in one zip code can be a violation 2 hours down the highway. What worked perfectly for the man who built this exact cabin might trigger a fine, a forced relocation, or a full reclassification onto someone else's property only a few counties over. This is not a reason to abandon the idea. It is a reason to call your local assessor's office before you cut a single piece of steel, ask the specific classification rules for trailers and mobile structures in your exact county, and get the answer in writing if you can. That single phone call costs nothing and can save years of legal headache later. What this cabin actually represents is bigger than one clever tax trick. It represents a quiet shift happening across rural and off-grid communities right now, where men are realizing that permanence is not the same thing as security, and that a well-built structure on wheels can survive a winter just as brutally and comfortably as a house bolted to foundation, without the same decades-long financial leash attached to it. For most of modern history, owning land and owning a permanent structure on it was treated as the single proof that a man had made it, that he had arrived, that he was finally stable. But stability built entirely on a tax bill that grows every single year, regardless of income, regardless of job security, regardless of health, is not actually stability at all. It is a fixed cost disguised as an achievement, and it keeps climbing whether a man's paycheck climbs with it or not. A structure like this one flips that entire equation. It says ownership does not require permanence, and shelter does not require a tax bill that never stops growing for the rest of a man's life. The steel curve sheds the snow. The wood interior holds the heat. The stove keeps the cold at bay through the worst nights of the year. And the trailer underneath quietly keeps the entire structure one short legal step away from the tax bill that follows almost every other homeowner in this country for the rest of their lives. That is the real story here. Not a trick, not a gimmick. A different way of thinking about what a home actually has to be in order to survive a winter, and in order to survive the system built around owning land in the first place. The men building these are not chasing a loophole for the sake of beating the system. They are chasing the same thing every generation before them chased: shelter, warmth, and a roof that will hold against the worst weather a winter can throw at it, without a permanent financial weight bolted on underneath it. The wheels are not the point. The wheels are simply the legal mechanism that lets the real point happen without 30 years of property tax bills standing in the way. If you found this useful, the most valuable thing you can do before attempting anything like it yourself is the one phone call mentioned earlier in this video to your own local assessor's office, asking the exact classification rules in your exact county. That single call is worth more than any video, including this one, because the rules on your land are the only rules that actually matter to you. Let me know in the comments if you found this helpful, and subscribe for more videos about how to survive cold winters.